Professor Scott Lucas joins me to talk more about whether this is realistically possible, the larger implications of this in terms of the trust deficit between the US and its NATO allies. Professor Scott Lucas, let me start by asking you just that, whether this is realistically possible or not.
Let's assume, however, that the Europeans could, in effect, take over the code and continue to operate the F-35s if the U.S. threatened not to provide software updates. Well, you would have a legal case, which takes precedence. Would it be the U.S. requirement that any operation of its F-35s be in accordance with its standards and guidelines? Or would the Europeans be able to argue that there was a threat of imminent risk because the U.S. was no longer cooperating over the F-35s? And then politically, what would be the repercussions for the Europeans if they did this? But I think I have to tell you that there would already, if this situation ever arose, we would already be at a point of a serious U.S.-European breakdown, because what you're saying is that U.S. politicians are not allowing their European allies to operate essential warplanes. That, in other words, they are blackmailing Europe by saying, you do what we want, or you can no longer operate the F-35s. Now, certainly the Trump camp have brought us to the point of a serious break with Europe by effectively abandoning the alliance. But I still don't think we're at the point where U.S. military officials are going to hold the Europeans to ransom over the F-35s. So I still think that this question of Europe taking over the code of the F-35s is a hypothetical rather than a real situation.
And do you see any of that actually impacting the larger US-EU ties, particularly in the backdrop of growing trust deficit, in the backdrop of a need and a clamor within the European governments to increase defense spending?
We're already in the midst of unprecedented European discussions, at least since 1945. And that is because of the Trump camp's threats and its possible refusal of cooperation. Europe is now having to talk about being self-sufficient, or at least not reliant on the United States for defense capabilities. So we're already in the midst of a European quest announced by the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen for 800 billion euros in defense investment and production over the next 5 years. We're already in the midst of countries such as France and Germany discussing unprecedented levels of military cooperation, including over the French nuclear arsenal. That's how far this has gone. Now, in the specific case raised by the State Secretary of the Dutch Defense Ministry, Mr. Tuinman, what you have is, I think, an issue that Europe has to consider its jet fighter capability. If you really do not have a U.S. which can be trusted anymore, where do you go where you don't have to rely on the F-35, which is still probably the world's most advanced jet fighter? Is there a European equivalent that can be developed or upgraded in the near future?
All right, we leave it there. Professor Lucas, thanks much for speaking to me.
Hi, I'm Scott Lucas. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what you see, subscribe, spread the word, send ideas.